Good evening. Welcome back to the web lecture series organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQAC. It's a great honor and privilege that we have with us today Professor Indranil Acharya from Vidyasagar University. And he will deliver his talk on intersectionality and the representation of identity in the literature of the marginalized, the Indian context. On behalf of the Department of English and on behalf of IQAC, I heartily welcome sir to this lecture. And I think our students are waiting for this lecture and they will be enriched to a great extent by this lecture. So before this talk, I would like to request Dr. Bashav Datta Ghosh, Assistant Professor of our department, to introduce our expert for today's session.
Thank you, sir. Professor Indranil Acharya is a professor at the Department of English, Vidyasagar University since 2008. His area of specialization are the literature of the marginalized in translation, unwritten languages, oral literature, tribal culture, documentation, translation, and analysis of endangered folk drama of West Bengal. He has published numerous research papers and articles in national and international journals like Litscape, Rupkatha, Proceedings of International Folklore Congress, and so on. He has written and edited several books on the languages, folk tales, and tribal culture of West Bengal. He has coordinated a number of UGC research projects. He is one of the advisors of the Central Sahitya Academy, New Delhi, and member of multiple prestigious literary societies like National Editorial Collective of People's Linguistic Survey of India, Indian Association for the Study of Australia, Indian Folklore Congress, and many more. He received the Award for Excellence in Book Production to Sriti Biloper Pore and Poshchimbongir Bhasha. He is a visiting professor at the University of Delhi. Today, he will be talking on a very relevant issue of present time in his lecture entitled Intersectionality and the Representation of Identity in the Literature of the Marginalized, the Indian Context. It is a great privilege and honor for us to have you with us, sir. Our students would be very much enriched by your lecture. Thank you for giving us time from your busy schedule. The platform is all yours, sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Shondeep, for giving me this opportunity to give a talk to your students, research scholars, and faculty members in the Department of English, Ulubedia College. And I hope that apart from the members of the Department of English, there are other interested students, scholars, and faculty members who are also attending this lecture. Anyway, I would like to thank the Department of English, Ulubedia College, for organizing this web lecture series. And I would also like to thank the college authority, the principal, and other members of the governing body for allowing you to conduct this web lecture series. And in a way, it's really quite heartening to be able to say a few words about intersectionality, Dalit writing, marginalized literature, and also the question of identity in the context of India. In fact, I deem it a privilege to speak about it. But before I move into the details of my lecture, now is the screen available to you? Can you follow the slides? Hello? Sandeep, can you follow the
No,
slides?
no, sir, it's not visible yet.
Oh, it's not visible. Anyway, I have shared it from my window. Just let me check for a minute.
Sure, sir.
Application window. Is it visible?
No,
Is it
sir, not
visible?
till now. No, sir.
No, not yet.
No, sir, not yet.
Okay, then maybe some problem. I have the PowerPoint in the minimized mode. Uh,
Sir, have you clicked the share screen option?
yes, I have clicked that.
Yes, sir. Then do it twice. Then select the application window.
Yes.
Then click on the icon. I mean, where your PPT is available. Click on that icon. Then click on the share option again. You need to select the icon and then click the share option at last.
Okay. The icon is not showing here. That is the problem in the application window. It's only the sound item that I'm getting in the application window.
Okay, sir. If you have opened the PPT presentation and kept it in a minimized form, it should be there.
It's there in the minimized form.
Okay, sir. If there is any problem, you can just continue with your speech without the presentation. I think that's not a big problem.
Okay, in that
Sir,
case,
it's
let me
coming,
do
I
it.
guess. Sir, it's coming, I guess.
Oh, it's
I'm
coming.
adding it to the stream. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
But sir, it's not still visible. But it is present here. But it's not showing anything. So please get it maximized.
Is it visible now?
Not yet, sir.
Because I have put it in the PPT mode.
No,
Is
sir.
it
It's
visible
not.
now?
No, sir. Not till now.
Okay, then let us stop it for the time being. Yeah, and let me
Yes,
continue
sir. Yes, sir.
because
You please.
we are anyway. The title of today's presentation is Intersectionality and the Representation of Identity in the Literature of the Marginalized, the Indian Context. Let me tell you that this idea of intersectionality is borrowed from the domain of sociology, as the students of sociology are well aware of the theory of intersectionality and how it emerged in the context of the African American feminist movement and how the idea developed in order to accommodate the uniqueness and the specialized needs of the African American women in the context of the first and second waves of feminism. So, intersectionality, in a way, is an inclusive concept which does not merely restrict our reading of different social parameters in a very compartmentalized or highly categorized manner. In fact, intersectionality allows us to look at different social parameters and constructions of social identity from a very fluid, overlapping and relative manner. So, the relationality of different social parameters like race, class, gender, ethnicity, and many others, in fact, can be addressed and can be included within the notion of intersectionality. And it developed in order to address, as I've already mentioned, the typical issues of the African American women in the context of feminism. Later, it broadened in its scope and application, and we find that it was applied to other domains of research as well. And I have connected intersectionality to the idea of representation of identity, because you know that in the context of the literature of the marginalized, the idea of identity, marginalized identity, becomes of paramount importance. In fact, how do we find the representation of identity in the literature of the marginalized, particularly by the authors who are born into the marginalized communities and who write about their own community experiences, their experiences of pain and suffering, their experiences of insult and humiliation, their experiences of different strands of exclusion and marginalization. So identity and the entire problematics of identity become a major issue in the discussion of any literary work by a marginalized author. And as you know that if we talk about literature of the marginalized in general, we have to refer to different regions of the world, different nations of the world, where we find the presence of marginalized communities, and how there had been different literary traditions to capture the experience of marginality in different countries, in different geographical settings, at different historical points of time. So when we talk about literature of the marginalized in a global context, okay, we have to talk about the situation of the Native American people in the North American context, okay, literature of the Native American people. Okay, we have to talk about the people of the First Nations in the Canadian context. Okay, we have to talk about different tribal literary representations in the context of Africa, the vast African continent, and the literature of different African tribal communities, indigenous groups. Okay, we should also talk about the Caribbean, the migration of the African people, large scale migration of African people connected to the slave trades, and how they peopled the Caribbean islands, and how there had also been the development of a different tradition of marginalized literature. And of course we should move on to the Australian and the New Zealand contexts, okay, where Australian Aboriginal literature is also a major example of the literature of the marginalized, how the Aborigines have captured the gradual dislocation, cultural, territorial, existential, dislocation from their cultural practices, cultural traditions, from their own worldview, indigenous worldviews, with the advent of the white people, the white colonizers, 1788 onwards. So it's a long story of the literature of the marginalized in the Australian Aboriginal context. And apart from that, we also find that there had been various marginalized communities in the South Asian context, and we find in different countries of the South Asia, the huge South Asian region, we find how different countries have experienced different forms of writings of about the marginalized experiences, about the marginalized communities. And today I have decided to focus on the Indian context because in the Indian context, the experience of marginality, okay, has been there since the Vedic times. And in the post Vedic times, when we look at the different forms of Brahminical texts and scriptures in the Indian society, and if we look at different Brahminical rule in the Indian history, and especially people who favored and promoted the cause of the upper castes, if we look at that history of Indian subcontinent, we find that the marginalized had always been there as almost an invisible presence in the Indian social context. And in fact, the marginalized had been there as the invisible and yet indispensable part of the Indian population since time immemorial. So, and we all of us have read about different interpretations and different explanations given to the rise of the Aryan and the non-Aryan cultures, and especially the Aryan and Dravidian cultures, and how ancient the Dravidian culture was, and in a way, before the advent of the Aryans, who were the indigenous people of this land, who were the aborigines to this land, and how the different tribal communities were later way subjugated, dominated, and controlled by the upper caste people, first by the Aryans, then by their descendants, and later with the advent of the Islamic forces. We find also during the medieval times how the Sultanate regimes and also the Mughal regime completely, in a way, created a new kind of system of governance, and which also once again placed the marginalized people in the lower strata of society, and how in a way their situation, their plight never changed, only different forms of governance came into existence, but there was a continuous saga of pain and suffering, of in a way humiliation, in a way exclusion and marginalization of these people in the Indian context. In fact, in the pre-colonial period and also during the colonial period, we find the advent of British also created a new kind of anglicized Western culture, and which once again put the marginals in a piquant situation, and how they were dominated in a new way, and how the Sanskritized culture gave way to the Anglicized culture, and in a way it was a kind of transfer from one form of dominance to another form of dominance, and the plight of the miserable people, the marginalized, continued to be the same. Okay, there was no visible change in the social structure, in the social hierarchy. Okay, and regarding this, especially in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, with the rise of the different movements, different kind of leadership, particularly in the southwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, particularly in Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, okay, the western and southern states of India. If we look at the rise and development of the movements by the marginalized people, okay, we find that gradually there had been a rising consciousness in the minds of the marginalized people, under the leadership of different social reformers, okay, who represented the lower class of people, the lower castes in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, people like Mahatma Jyotiba Rao Phule, okay, Savitri Bai Phule, and of course Dr. Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, okay, and many others, many other unsung, leaders of the movement of the marginalized, and even some, rarely known, women writers, okay, women authors who spoke about their experiences of marginality, and all the later development, especially in the post-independent India. Okay, we find that how the new government, the freedom, okay, brought about certain changes in the in the condition of the marginalized people, how there had been many constitutional provisions made for the marginalized people to safeguard and protect their human rights, their basic human rights, how there were, many acts, in a way, passed in the parliament. Okay, many administrative reforms were made to address the pain and sufferings of the marginalized communities. And the entire history of the developments of the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and the other backward classes, and how in a way there had been a persistent attempt to develop a place for the marginalized communities in the Indian democratic setup, okay, in the Indian socialist setup. In fact, by the constitutional provisions, through the constitutional measures. Okay, so we are more or less aware of these developments, but in a way, when we look at the idea of intersectionality, and today I will be speaking specifically about a large group of marginalized people, okay, who had been outside the purview of the mainstream society, in fact who had often been outside the purview of the discourse on marginality available in the Indian context. In fact, I will speak about them, who are even by the last census of 2011, who are even more than 11 crore in India, the denotified and nomadic tribes. Okay, I will be speaking about them. I will be discussing or referring to some of the autobiographies, okay, available in English translation, okay, written by the denotified and nomadic tribe authors. So I will show you how there is a kind of fourth world, okay, which is even within the third world, and even this fourth world is again once again hierarchized in terms of representation, in terms of gaining different advantages, okay, the benefits of governmental policies, and how there had been a graded inequality even in the fourth world, where these DNTs are perhaps the most marginalized section of Indian society, and how there is marginality within marginality. Okay, so that is a very important aspect of what we should say sociological point of view and sociological approach to the reading of literature, particularly the literature of the DNTs, that I would like to talk about for some time today. And as you can see from this slide, the idea of intersectionality, where Kimberly Crenshaw, the person who first used this term, okay, used it to describe how gender, race, class, and many other factors, important parameters, play a role in the oppression faced by an individual. And if we look at intersectionality as a theoretical approach, we find that it recognizes the dynamics, the relationships, and connections between different categories of identity. Okay, so it's a very intrinsically overlapping, interconnected, problematic, often internally contradictory, inherently contradictory kind of connections, kind of relationships between different categories of identity, such as race, class, gender, sexuality, and even ability. Because one major emerging area of marginality studies is disability studies, and therefore ability also becomes an important parameter of the construction of identity, marginalized identity, and how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create unique modes of discrimination and privilege. So I will be mostly talking about unique modes of discrimination in today's lecture, because how a person's social and political identities can combine and thereby create certain unique forms of discrimination. In fact, the emergence of intersectionality in the Western context, we know, developed with the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, it coincides with the movement of the marginalized groups, particularly the term which we use to describe this movement is Dalit. Dalit movement. If you look at the history of Dalit movement, the origin and development of Dalit movement, you will find that it gained prominence after the sad demise of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and how there had been the first impulse of the social movement, the revolutionary movement was felt in Maharashtra, okay, under the visionary in a way leadership of Dr. Ambedkar. In fact, the guidance of Dr. Ambedkar, he was no more, but there were many firebrand Dalit intellectuals, authors, writers, activists, okay, who took up this Dalit movement in the 1960s, and in the 1970s it gained momentum. There was the formation of the Dalit Panthers, and it was inspired by the Black Panthers movement, okay, in the African American context. And you would find how the identity politics, okay, became quite an emerging concept, and in a way a very hip and happening concept in the Indian subcontinent also during the 1960s and the 1970s. We see a full scale awareness of this identity politics during this time, particularly to include different experiences of women of color, poor women, immigrant women, and many of them different categories of marginalized people, okay, who were not accommodated in the mainstream discourse. In fact, intersectionality allows people to understand one another in a broader spectrum instead of by one trait. That is what I will be speaking about in today's talk. That we look at the denotified and nomadic tribes as erstwhile criminal tribe, but we look at them only from the point of view of their erstwhile criminal identity, criminal nature, tagged by the British government, okay, branded by the British government as criminal people. But we don't look into the other parameters which are continually at work in the construction of their identity, and how intersectionality plays a major role. The approach, the intersectional approach, helps us to understand the common ground with others and to better relate to the people around them. Okay. And intersectionality is also based in the standpoint theory. So the point of view is very important. So there are different criticisms of also this idea of intersectionality, but as a whole, intersectionality helps us to understand the complex functioning of different parameters in the construction of marginalized identity, particularly in the Indian context, especially with regard to the denotified and nomadic tribes. And if we look at the dimensions of identity, there are many factors that contribute to the difficulties in a person's life. If only one point of oppression or privilege is focused on, it causes misunderstanding of that individual's identity. So, intersectionality, and another word that is relationality of power structures within Indian society, and how to work across identities with this history of colonial power structures. In fact, the infamous Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 created a kind of colonial power structure with regard to the denotified and nomadic tribes. These people, okay, which was perpetuated even in the post-colonial India, in the free India, in the liberated country, okay, and experienced by the people who are still subjugated, who are still colonized, who still experience a kind of new colonial regime. So intersectionality in practice can be applied, as I have already mentioned, to all fields from politics, education, economics to marginality studies. In fact, the impact of patriarchy and traditional assumptions of gender and families are evident in marginalized women, like third world women. Also, fourth world women are not homogeneous. In fact, intersectionality emphasizes the idea of heterogeneity. okay, that whatever we consider as marginality, or say marginalized group or marginalized literature, okay, is not a homogeneous entity. Okay, there are different trends. There are many departures and diversions. There are many region specific and history specific uniqueness of marginalized literature in different regions in different points of time. So the fourth world, the construction of the fourth world is once again based on the principles of plurality, of diversity, okay, of heterogeneity, okay, that we have to understand. And now, I would like to focus on this literature of the denotified tribes, nomadic and denotified tribes. Denotified 68 years ago, criminal tribes still fight stigma and poverty. So 31st August is celebrated as Liberation Day by the denotified nomadic tribes across India, but real freedom stays far-fetched as social stigma and systemic discrimination continue to affect people belonging to such tribes. In fact, if you look at the large unorganized sector in the Indian economy, if you look at the workforce, the unorganized workforce of our Indian democratic setup, you would find that, okay, a sizable percentage of this unorganized workforce, okay, constitutes of these erstwhile criminal tribes, these DNTs, these denotified and nomadic tribes. I've already mentioned that they are already 11 crore plus. Okay. And all of us have seen many disturbing images during the early days of the COVID pandemic, okay, when we saw the large scale, exodus of the unorganized sector laborers, okay, who were evicted from their places of work, and they were rendered unemployed, they were rendered homeless, okay, and how they had to return, okay, to their home. Okay, so anyway, it could be thousands of miles away, and how we know that many of them started their journey back home on foot, and how some of them, okay, were killed by some accidents, and how tragedy visited their lives, and all of us have seen it. So these are in a way the invisible segment of our democracy, okay, the voiceless, the subaltern section of Indian democracy, okay, which had remained at the periphery, okay, which had always remained, okay, at the bottommost level of Indian, okay, social hierarchy, okay, in the social order, okay, and who have received this experiences of humiliation since time immemorial. In fact, I quote from the observations made by one research scholar, a PhD scholar, Sudam Rathore, from the Laman Banjara tribe. Yes, it's a nomadic tribe of Maharashtra. And Sudam writes, I quote, there is a stereotype against denotified nomadic tribes in police, media, society, and even some judges. So look how it even exists in the judiciary. Every member of this community is considered a criminal by the virtue of birth, and the stigma continues till they die. So this is the stigma, which is indelible. So this is the stigma which they had to carry throughout their life. So the branding of a criminal, okay, that they are branded as a criminal, okay, is perhaps the worst form of humiliation which these people, these tribal people, have to experience, have to bear with throughout their life. In fact, when I shall be referring to some of these autobiographies available in English translation, you will come to understand the nature and extent of humiliation, okay, the stigma, how they carry the stigma. I also refer to another Supreme Court verdict. Okay, it's in the next slide. In March 2019, the Supreme Court had set aside its own 2009 judgment and set 6 convicts free who were earlier sent to death row. It was the first of its kind ruling. They were convicted by multiple courts, including the apex court, in a famous rape and multiple murder case of Nashik district. In fact, the Supreme Court said the 6 men were falsely implicated and roped in by the police. All 6 of them, who spent 16 years in jail for a crime they never committed, belong to the nomadic tribes formerly declared as born criminals. So you can understand how the stigma of criminality, in a way, made these people, these 6 men, to suffer, without committing a crime. How these innocent people had to suffer tremendously on false charges only because of their identity, only because of their that colonial, continuation of the notion of criminality. In fact, in West Bengal, you will find there are 3, erstwhile criminal tribes: the Lodhas, the Khadiyas, and the Dhikaros. Okay. And you will find even in the 21st century, if there is any case of, burglary or a petty theft, in the locality, where we find, Lodhas, Lodhas villages are nearby, we find that, on many occasions the police would arrest some Lodha young men, without producing any kind of warrant. They arrest them, put them in, say, custody, and in a way there is also, perpetration of violence and torture. So they become very soft target. Even in free India, they become very soft target. These people, because of this, ignominious, history, this past, this past which is rather highly stigmatized. I refer to the Habitual Offenders Act in the next slide. DNTs are the tribes which were notified as criminal tribes under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 by the British colonial government. And it was mainly because they resisted the British policy of occupying the forest areas and, in a way, evicting the original inhabitants of the forest tribes to other places. So this territorial dislocation, was not accepted by many tribes, and in order to contain their rebellious nature, the British colonial government declared that, passed that Criminal Tribes Act in 1871. And after decades of facing the horrors of this racial act, no, this was a brutal act. No, they were denotified by the government of independent India on 31st August 1952. They were denotified. But the Criminal Tribes Act, unfortunately, was repealed, only to be replaced by another, discriminatory act, Habitual Offenders Act, which was also, very insulting in a way, and it includes certain provisions whereby they could be, detained, say, without even producing a warrant. So the process of exploitation, the process of this discrimination, still continues, in the 21st century. And in this connection, I would like to refer to the Budhan theatre, which is actually about the tragedy of Budhan Shabar, who belonged to the erstwhile criminal tribe, the Khadiya tribe. And Budhan was, tortured and killed in the police custody, for, certain charges, false charges, crimes which he had never committed. And since 1998, we find Budhan theatre a very powerful folk performance theatre, theatre of resistance, developed. It has performed plays to raise awareness about the conditions of many marginalized groups, particularly the denotified and nomadic tribes. One of their main goals is to, I quote, demonstrate that DNTs are not born criminals. They are humans with real emotions, capacities, and aspirations. Unquote. The group was started, after the noted Bengali author Mashweta Devi suggested that they make a play on the custodial death of Budhan Sabar in a West Bengal jail, in a Purulia jail. And in fact, the tragedy of Budhan, okay, in fact, created a huge uproar in the media, and it became news in the national media as well. And you would find that the impact of Budhan's tragedy reached the western coast of India, Gujarat, okay, to Ahmedabad. Okay, and in Ahmedabad, there was a colony of the DNTs at Charanagar. There was a DNT, a denotified tribe known as the Chara tribe, and one young educated person, the first graduate of that Chara tribe, Dakshin Bajrangi, decided to form a theater group, with some enthusiastic members from the DNT community, and they created the Budhan Theater. Okay, and it has now attracted global attention, and Budhan Theater has been performed in different countries of the world, and it has also been made into a memorable film recently, with some patronage that we find in America as well. Now, United Nations also observed in 2007, the United Nations Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination asked the Indian government to repeal the Habitual Offenders Act and effectively rehabilitate them, the DNTs. In its concluding observation, it expressed concern and stated that, I quote, the so-called denotified and nomadic, which are listed for their alleged criminal tendencies under the former Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, continue to be stigmatized under the Habitual Offenders Act of 1952. So we find that these denotified and nomadic tribes had been quite arbitrarily placed under different categories of SCs, STs, and even OBCs. Okay, so this vast population of more than 11 crore people had not been properly accommodated, okay, in the Indian social structure, in the Indian social system, okay, in terms of their tribal identity, okay, in terms of their regional variations, okay, in terms of their linguistic identity. In fact, most of the time we find that the governmental and even non-governmental agencies have remained in a way unaware of the miserable plight of these people, these 11 crore plus people falling under the denotified, nomadic, or semi-nomadic tribe categories. So in 2008, the National Commission for Denotified, Nomadic, and Semi-Nomadic Tribes, it was formed, but still it's a long way to go. And as I have already mentioned, that the pandemic has also caused terrible suffering to the most marginalized sections of Indian society, these DNTs, denotified tribes, and they have lost their different jobs, they have lost their work, and many of them were performing artists, folk performers. They have also lost their shows, and many folk performers have turned to begging. And in fact, we find that during the pandemic, the DNTs have faced perhaps, or perhaps are facing the worst time, the worst crisis in their life. The social stigma is always there, and I would like to quote from one observation made by Dakshin Chara. I have just referred to his Budhan theater. I referred to Dakshin, one quotation. Dakshin ruefully says, I quote, I have been successful in getting a number of prestigious national and international awards but in the eyes of the lowest rank of constable, Dakshin Chara may not be anything more than a criminal. So that is the attitude of society. And in this connection, I now move on to the autobiographical texts uh, produced by the authors, the DNT authors. And the first one I refer to here is a DNT autobiography. Okay, English rendering is Against All Odds. The original was written in Marathi. Unfortunately, no, these DNTs cannot use their mother tongue. They cannot write in their mother tongue, their own tribal language, because that is derecognized. So they have to learn another language, the state language. They have to write in Marathi. Okay, and Koltiache Por, translated into English as Against All Odds, published by Penguin in 2000. Okay, we find is a major autobiography by an author who belonged to Kishore Santabai Kale, who belonged to one of these DNTs. And if we look at this autobiography, we find that there is a boy narrator who tells about his horrible childhood experiences, the experiences of pain and suffering, of becoming the target of violent, means, and also becoming, in a way, the target of the sexual leers of the adult world, of the upper caste, and how a boy from the erstwhile criminal tribe, okay, has to bear the brunt of this identity, okay, the criminal identity. In fact, this autobiography is that of a boy studying in the fifth grade. And throughout this autobiography, we find very disturbing episodes of violence, insult, and also identity crisis, because the author suffers from the identity, particularly of his parents. Okay, his mother has deserted him. He doesn't know anything about his father, and everywhere he is ridiculed for his unknown parentage. And the insult and identity crises are elaborately narrated. In fact, there are some occasions when he has to hide his caste identity as well. And we are reminded of Baburao Bagul's work, where the famous anthology of stories, When I Hid My Caste. So, the necessity of hiding one's caste in order to overcome the social stigma. Now, identity of a child laborer, which we find here, that the boy narrator describes how his study was severely affected due to certain, compulsions which he had to follow in order to earn his livelihood, and how there was compulsory child labor and total denial of any human rights to the child, and how the hostile fellow community members compelled the child to engage in different forms of manual labor, and how they didn't appreciate the child's genuine concern to continue his study. In fact, the ridicules were genuine. Okay, and in a way, he has a genuine urge for education, but others were always very ridiculous, very insulting, to his genuine aspirations for learning. And I read one section from this autobiography. The boy narrator says, I quote, "People were rude and insulting to me since a young Kolhati boy." He belonged to the Kolhati community, which is a DNT community. Kolhati boy obviously could not command any respect from the kind of people who came there. I was a delicate looking boy, and some of the men kissed me and touched my private parts. So, look how this Kolhati community was a traditional community of folk performers, and they mostly participated in the Marathi tamasha, folk tamasha performances. And what happened that the tamashas gradually degenerated into different types of very ugly and sexual and very erotic displays by women performers, and how prostitution loomed large in these tamasha community performances, and how particularly women were targeted. And along with the women, this boy narrator was also abused, physically and mentally, because he had to serve to the needs of the rich people, the affluent people who used to visit these tamasha shows, and how in a way they abused the little boy and also the women. So if you read the autobiography, you will find that there is no concern about the future of this boy, and how many such boys like this boy narrator, okay, have to in a way give up their study at a very early age and join, okay, some of their traditional occupations, and how they have to continue in that ignoble job throughout their lives. In fact, how the boy narrator had to play the role of a gigolo in the tamasha. I have mentioned it here. The rude and insulting upper caste people, and in a way, how it was a kind of degraded form of treatment. How there was no humanity that we could find in this life, in this world of the Kolhati boys, and how they became object of carnal pleasure for the upper caste people. In fact, it was not merely the treatment which they received, the abusive treatment which they received from the upper caste people. They also became target of violence and torture by their own community people. They were also victims of domestic violence. Okay, and there is one very appalling kind of, very disturbing kind of incident, very disturbing narrative, where we find how the grandfather of the boy narrator in a way stole the boy narrator's hard-earned money and purchased liquor, okay, by that hard-earned money of the boy narrator. Okay, and what happened that they, in fact, when the boy narrator confronted and he discovered that his money had been stolen by his grandfather, when he protested, okay, he was severely beaten up. Okay. So how we find that even within the familial politics of say this DNT community, okay, how the boy narrator, how the child becomes a victim of marginalization, how there is marginality within marginality, how there are layers of marginality which we can experience, which we can observe, okay, in the life of the Kolhati community. But I read one section, you'll be able to understand, when the boy narrator says he has already discovered that his grandfather has stolen his money, no, 50 rupees. Accusing anyone of stealing would have invited a beating. So I said nothing, but anger burned in my heart. In the evening, Ajoba, that is the grandfather, came back with bottles of liquor. Aji, the grandmother, cooked fish and then sat down to drink with Ajoba. I was sitting outside watching them and listening to their conversation. The anger in my heart was turning into rage. Aji asked, Daru ku kada se paise laye? Where did you get the money to buy this alcohol? Before Ajoba, the grandfather, could answer, I shouted, Give my money back. You should be ashamed of yourself, stealing a child's money. Grandfathers give money to their grandchildren, not steal from them. My rage was spilling out, and I could not control it. Those 50 rupees would have taken care of my school expenses for the whole year. And I had done all kinds of course and back-breaking work to earn the money at the tamasha show. Ajuba picked up his stick and charged at me, yelling, I will beat you. till you die, you vermin, how dare you insult me? Look, when he points out the act of theft, when he protests, okay, he is threatened with corporeal punishment. So we find that even within the DNT community life, okay, there are many there are many complex, intersectional, dynamics of, torture. Okay, there is hierarchy, and we find how the treatment, how the discriminatory treatment is hierarchically, pushed down the order, and how, Dalit male, the DNT men who receive, discriminatory treatment from the upper caste pass it vigorously to the little children, especially, such little boys. And we find that this tradition of physical torture, of intimidation, of torture, okay, of, in a way, corporeal punishment, okay, had become a way of life for these, DNT people. Okay, in this life it had become a part of their life. We also find, okay, many other disturbing pictures of violence, okay, which is perpetrated, by the adult members, okay, the bread earning members of these DNT communities, okay, upon the helpless, girl children, okay, or the helpless, boy, okay, who had to bear the brunt of their brutal treatment. Okay, the hierarchy within the lower castes. In fact, in this connection, we are also reminded of the observation of Dr. Ambedkar, okay, where, in his famous speech at Mahad, the famous Mahad Satyagraha speech, where Dr. Ambedkar observed that, okay, each and every, section of the Indian social structure, Indian social hierarchy, particularly the caste based hierarchical system of Indian society, okay, would always prefer to maintain the status quo. No, especially the lower order in the hierarchy would always be careful of maintaining the status quo. So the Ati Shudras, the Dalits, the Panchamas, the untouchables will not get any help from the Shudras. Okay, so it will not be wise to expect that the other people from the lower caste would help them. Dr. Ambedkar says that this is the kind of struggle which the Ati Shudras have to fight it out for themselves. So this is the kind of revolution in which they have to take the initiative. But at the same time, we also find that these Ati Shudras, these Panchamas are also, hierarchized. Okay, their society is also divided into many forms of intersectionality. Okay, their identities are also constructed on the basis of these intersectional, these relativists, in a way, intermingling of different forms of experience of marginalization, which is perpetuated, which is replicated even in the Dalit society, in the Dalit life, in the Dalit family. No, at the micro level, okay, we find the reflection, we find the perpetuation of this kind of treatment. So there are other, autobiographies. There are some very important autobiographies available in English translation. It is not possible for any, person to include and discuss satisfactorily all the autobiographies available in English translation, but I would, in a way, like to refer to other autobiographies which have also drawn our attention to this complex dynamics of identity formation in the DNT communities, and how, in a way, marginalized identity is constructed even within the marginalized communities. Okay, in terms of the power relations, in terms of the prevalent power structures, okay, which are there, okay, even in the marginalized societies. Okay, so it's not like, a very binary kind of structure where the non-Dalit and Dalit binary could be the only way of understanding the discourse of discrimination in terms of Dalit experience. Okay, there are, other subtler forms of discrimination and other subtler forms of perpetuation of these discriminatory practices, even within, Dalit societies, even within the nomadic societies. Okay, where, patriarchy, where economic empowerment, where other, okay, considerations, other parameters of empowerment, okay, always compulsorily, create new forms of, discrimination, new forms of hierarchy, okay, new forms of perpetration of violence, okay, and new forms of subjugating the disempowered, within the broader perspective of the marginalized societies. Okay, one such autobiography is Upara. In Marathi, it is entitled Upara. The English rendering is An Outsider by Laxman Mane. Laxman Mane is also a major, DNT author, and it was also praised by Arjun Dangle as a remarkable example of Dalit autobiography. But strictly speaking, these are, apart from being ideologically Dalit writings, they are specifically, ontologically speaking, speaking from the point of view of identity politics, they are typical, products of the erstwhile criminal tribes, because Dalit includes the experiences of untouchability, whereas these DNT autobiographies add another dimension, another experience of, another marker of discrimination, that is criminality. So this is a community where we find the experience of both untouchability and criminality. Both of them are operative in this context. In fact, in Upara, we also find another boy narrator, and we also find how the story of, subjugation and marginalization continues unabated in a different context, in a different nomadic tribal context. The third one that I would like to refer to is entitled Tanda. In Marathi, the word is Tanda, the title is Tanda. The English translation is The Camp. It's by Atmaram Rathod. Atmaram Rathod, who belong to the Banjara, tribe, Banjara nomadic tribe, and how, there is a sense of perpetual unbelonging in the people of this community, and how they don't have that sense of history, and how they also don't have any sense of rootedness, and how their nomadic migrant life also brings along with it many tragic experiences, and especially, for the boy narrator, the author who narrates his experience as a boy and later as an adolescent, a companion of, say, a very influential, Banjara tribe leader, okay, who gains prominence in the political field, and how he changes his behavior, how he separates himself from the other community people, and how he, in a way, emulates the political, discourse of the upper caste politicians. And Sanawatji is such a character, and how the boy narrator exposes, ruthlessly, the hypocrisy which we find in one empowered, tribal community, a Banjara community political leader, say in an otherwise disempowered community, how an empowered person perpetuates that structure of exploitation and marginalization, how he assumes a dominant role, almost a Gandhian figure, and how he, in a way, sermonizes and creates a new cult of himself, and in a way, thereby practices and rehearses the politics of the center in the context of the politics of the margins. So that we will find if we read this autobiography. And the last one, the fourth one, which I would also like to refer to, is The Branded. The title is The Branded. The Marathi title is Uchale. Uchale means the branded. It's written by Lakshman Gaikwad. Once again, he belonged to the Bhamta tribe, another nomadic tribe, DNT, Denotified Tribe. So we find how the inhuman treatment which he had to experience, as an adolescent person in his own community, and how they received very shabby treatment from the police, from the administration, how these community of the professional burglars often had to land in trouble, and how they had to live this life of ignominy. And in fact, this autobiography is a kind of brutal confession by the boy narrator, who happens to be a student of the fourth grade, and how he was tortured by the problem of hunger, and how hunger becomes a major trope in the entire autobiography, as we also find it in Sharan Kumar Limbale's Akarmashi, how there was stealing of food from the share of the family members, stealing of food from the neighbors' place, and all kinds of stealing, and which was which were compelled by chill penury and of poverty, and in a way how the severe economic disadvantage forced these community people to take up the ignominious job of burglary, and how they had to thrive in this ignominious profession. Thieving is the only profession. So we find how we are in a way surprised and shocked to see that even in the independent India, even 70 years after independence, we find how people have to survive, okay, with these practices, and how in a way untouchability and criminality still operates, okay, in the social context, and how they create a complex web of intersectionality, and how in a way the purity and pollution trope becomes another very powerful kind of marker to discriminate between the people of the upper caste and these people who live on the margins, and who are the most marginalized people in the Indian social context, and in a way who are socially, economically, politically, culturally, in terms of all available parameters in Indian society, they are marginalized, they are excluded, and they are in a way subjugated in the most brutal manner. So this is more or less my submission for today. I have attempted to talk about the salient features of intersectionality, and how the idea of intersectionality can be related to the idea of marginality, particularly in the Indian context, and to be more specific, the construction of marginal identity. How can we apply intersectionality to the construction of marginal identity in the Indian context? I have selected only one segment of this vast domain of the literature of the marginalized, in the Indian context. Okay, but this segment is a highly neglected and in a way ignored segment. In fact, ignored in the academic circle as well, and of course ignored in the critical discourse. Some of these life narratives, some of these autobiographies available in English translation should also be in a way taken up for study and serious research, because they would add more fuel to the developing, in a way, uber of the Dalit literature, and in a way they would also add to different critical approaches to the reading of Dalit literature in the Indian context, because literature of the denotified and nomadic tribes, DNTs, can also be a very important, okay, contribution to the understanding of Dalit, okay, in its ideological connotations. Okay, so with these few words, I conclude my presentation for today. Thank you for your patient hearing and hope to meet you again. Thank you all.
So, on behalf of this Department of English of Uluberia College, I would like to express my gratitude and my thankfulness for this wonderful session. And I'm pretty sure that the students of our department and all the audience, they rather remained absolutely hooked up through this engaging session. And sir, we are also thankful for the fact that we know so busy you are, and from your busy schedule, you engaged time for us. So with your permission, we would like to take a few questions that are there in our chat box from our students. So, sir, could we? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So the first question is from Ipshita Bej, and her question is, sir, does this politics of representation in order to exact power performs the very practice of forming humans as invisible entity?
Does this politics of representation in order to exact power perform the very practice of forming humans as invisible entity? Yes, it's actually, the entire politics of subalternizing the marginalized community is actually an attempt to make them invisible.
Yes.
And we have muted them. We cannot hear their voice. They are voiceless. They are subalterns. And we are also trying to make them invisible in terms of, creating a kind of cultural amnesia. This is an expression used by Professor G.N. Devi, a famous, indigenous writer, author, critic, and activist. Amnesia, is a state of forgetfulness. So there had been a kind of, deliberate creation of an amnesiac environment whereby these people from the marginalized communities can forget everything about their traditional culture, their indigenous identity, and their history as a whole. So this had been operative. This principle, this process had been operative since the, pre-colonial times. Okay, it was, it gained momentum during the colonial period, but unfortunately, even in the post-colonial times, okay, there had been the process of subalternizing the people from the marginalized communities. The process is on.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your answer. There is an observation from Jolly Dash ma'am. The Kheria Sabars in their own Paschim Banga Kheria Sabar Kollan Samiti are engaged in making handicrafts in order to rehabilitate themselves. So this is a kind of support by fetching these ethnic items, and these are very much welcome.
Yes, this is fantastic. Thank you, Jolidi, for being there. I'm really grateful that our head of the department, Dr. Jolly Das, is present in today's lecture. In fact, this is a very pertinent observation. In fact, Khedia Shabor people have been able to empower themselves through the making of their own tribal handicrafts. In fact, the making of the handicrafts itself, the act of making the tribal handicrafts, has become a process of their rehabilitation. Yes, and we find that people like Mahashweta Devi, okay, people like Gopi Babu, Gopi, and people like Prashanto Rokhit and many others, okay, and Jolidi knows all of them. In fact, I would find that the non-tribal people have also made a significant contribution to the empowerment of the tribal people, especially in the context of the Khedia Shabar community. I can tell you that the contribution of the non-tribals, okay, has also become immense, quite immense. Okay, and they have inspired people like Bholanath Shabor, people like Jolodhar Shabor, to come up and tell their own narratives, okay, in order to document their own folklore. In fact, Prashanto Babu has documented, Khediya Shabor Lokokatha, okay, which has also been published by Sahitya Academy, okay, edited by Mahashweta Devi. And we in our Department of English, Vidyasagar University, are in the process of translating, Khediya Shabor Lokokatha into English. In fact, in our DRS project, Departmental Research Support Scheme project of UGC, which has recently concluded, we are still continuing with the translation, documentation, translation, and analysis of a large number of such Dalit and tribal texts, okay, which had remained outside the purview of the mainstream academia. So, in a way, we are also trying to rehabilitate the entire folkloric traditions of these marginalized tribal communities, okay, from an academic point of view. So, translation also becomes, okay, an instrument of empowerment, okay, for these, okay, marginalized communities. Thank you, Jolidi, for the observation.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Jolly Dash ma'am, for being with us. Our next question is from Ontim Beda, and his question is, sir, is not this practice of marginalization is more a state of mind than a subject of representation?
Practice of this is categorization plays a prominent role in marginalization.
So
Maksuda
this
Khatun,
question is from Mahshuda Khatun.
is not this practice of
Is not this
marginalization more a state of mind than a subject representation? Look here, Maksuda. In fact, the mental subjugation, that is what I have mentioned as cultural amnesia, or another term is also used here, cultural aphasia, aphasia. Aphasia is a medical condition. Aphasia means cutting off your tongue where you can't speak. Okay, you become silent, you are silenced. So cultural aphasia is also a terrible state of the mind where you are made a prisoner of a certain kind of ideology which is not of your own. In a way, you have to barter your mind, you have to sell out your mind to some foreign ideas. You are governed by other people's ideas. You can remember that famous coinage in Blake's The Tiger, mind forged manacles.
yes.
Mind forged manacles. So, manacles are created, okay, for the minds of the marginalized people. And if you can invade their mind, it becomes quite easier to invade their space, to invade their identity. Okay, so the state of mind, marginalization of the state of mind is a more terrible kind of practice than the marginalization of the body.
Thank you, sir. Thanks
Okay.
for your answer. I think she was trying to refer to the colonization of the mind and the necessity of decolonization of the mind as that.
Colonization
As
of
it
mind
is.
is definitely there. By I have referred to mind forged manacles, you know. So even there, we know that we need to decolonize our mind. It also refers to the, you know, the non-tribal people, you know, the scholars, the people from the academia, you know, for all of them.
Yeah. Sir,
I
here is the last question.
Yes,
Yeah.
please make it the last question.
Yes. Yeah. The last question is from Untim Bera. Sir, do you think that the very practice of categorization plays a prominent role in marginalization?
Yes, categorization plays a very prominent role in the process of marginalization. Because, you know, if you look at the linguistic survey of India, you know, a typical colonial text, knowledge text produced by Sir George Abraham Grierson, a very famous colonial linguist come administrator. If you look at one volume of linguistic survey of India, that is linguistic survey of Bengal, you know, part 1, look at that book, you will find that apart from Bengali, no other language, okay, spoken in Bengal is recognized as a language. And more importantly, the older tribal languages like Kudmali, like Malpahadiya, okay, they are described as dialects or subdialects or mixed subdialects. So, what is the purpose behind such categorization? The only purpose is to marginalize, exclude, and ignore them from the making of the discourse, from the making of the knowledge. You know, in the colonial knowledge production, in the politics of colonial knowledge production, categorization was essential in order to exclude certain communities, certain linguistic communities, certain cultural communities. It was essential. To categorize means to deny any full scale identity, any full scale status to certain communities which were regarded as threat to the monolingual structure of the colonial regime. No, so multilingualism was considered to be a threat. Plurality was considered to be a threat. Diversity was considered to be a threat.
So thank you so very much, sir, for widening their horizontal boundary in this very field of academia, and I'm pretty sure that in better days after this pandemic situation is over, the Department of English of Uluberia College would again be organizing a seminar and not this kind of a webinar. There we would be again be able to invite you, and we would like to meet you once again. So that is all from my part today. Now I would request Swata Das ma'am, Faculty Department of English, to give the vote of thanks.
Respected Sir, Professor Indranil Acharya, it is my privilege that I have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on the behalf of the Department of English of Uluberia College and the students, of course, here together, and on my own behalf, extend the gratitude for sharing with us your knowledge, your opinions, and findings today. I would just to take a moment over here, I would also like to express my acquiescence and acknowledgement of the greater relevance of your perspective in the contemporary but precedental times, that against all odds, all of us must feel the drive to intervene and help alter the rough course of the marginalized stream of injustice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.